Yeah.
Today I'm going to talk about my research project, my PhD project, so give you a general overview of what I'm working on, what's the topic and where this project is going. First, a few words of why I get an anecdote, why did I get interested in economic sanctions is that I was working before the PhD at the Polish Embassy in The Hague, at the Ministry of Trade, at the Trade Department, and this was in 2014 when European Union introduced economic sanctions on Russia, and then there were reciprocal sanctions of the European Union. And it was a very hot period or hot week at the ministry because we have received many calls and emails from the ministry and also from exporters saying that we're stuck with those products and you need to find alternative markets for us. And I was so that made me think about, well, my other sanctions, how do they work, and what's the world of sanction out there like. Just for the sake of clarity, when I speak about economic sanctions, I mean a suspension of the regular or normal trade patterns, and this can be either a ban on imports or exports, or financial sanctions, or a suspension of aid. And when I mean strategic, it's referring to sanctions that are not a trade war, but they actually have a purpose beyond the economic domain. So sanctions that sanctions that have an objective of winning eventually lower tariffs. For example, I know what Argentina and China had over soybeans and high added value products. They are not in scope of this project and interest, but sanctions that eventually lead to improvement of human rights or destabilizing the regime, so that the interest is beyond the economic sphere. That's where this project is looking at. Now first have a look at the pattern in economic sanctions over time. Here we have a graph for US and EU, but in general we see a major increase in the use of sanctions over time. And whereas before World War II we've seen very few instances of sanctions only and only two sanctions we would really consider with the current standards as economic sanctions. After World War II there was a major increase, and after 1990s the sanctions exploded. We have for US was the most active player in respect to economic sanctions historically. The EU only caught up in the 90s, and of course there are also other players that introduced sanctions. So out of 170 sanction incidents that Hofbauer, the major producer of data on sanctions and data set, claims, 2/3 come from the 90s. So it's 90s onwards. So it's a fairly recent phenomenon. Last 25 years for EU, last 15 years of explosion in the use of sanctions.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So here it was the bars show how often the EU imposes sanctions on other countries.
Yes. So it's how often EU has imposed a sanction on a country. Yeah, that's simply a count of sanction incidents. Oh no. Okay. What's also interesting is that sanctions seem to never work, or they work very rarely. Pape, there are two schools of looking at it. One comes from Pape, and he claims that only 5% of sanction incidents worked. There's the other one from Hofbauer, so again the major data producer. He claims the sanction work in 34% of cases. So here on the graph, here we have data for US sanctions, so in principle the most powerful tender, and divided into periods 19 to 25, 1925-50, 1950-75, and 75 to 2000. The bars on the left can be counted as most of the time rather negative outflow, and that's somehow somehow positive. So it's not that only they don't work, they seem to, the fact they don't work seems to be quite stable over time, and that's what most of the research acknowledges too, that this lack of effectiveness seems to be a feature that's quite common.
In the 60s, 70s it was. In the 50s to 75 it was pretty successful.
But that's only for the US. I mean that you have this one part here of successful, but these two were lack of success. And if you look at all the sanction incidents, so not only US, the ratio drops. So this is the most successful of the unsuccessful ones. What also is quite interesting is that we see more cooperation in economic sanctions, and that's puzzling because all the literature up until last year have indicated that multilateral sanctions are less effective than unilateral sanctions, so that it doesn't pay off to work together, or that too many cooks spoil the broth. And that's quite striking, given that that's again data for US. We see that US is increasingly trying to, so this is no cooperation, and those three represent some form of a cooperation from minor to significant. That's the way the Hubbauer devices data set, and again the same time periods, and we see an increase in the attempts of cooperating. So for the recent sanctions for last 15 years or so, 2/3 of the sanctions introduced actually involve some form of multilateral cooperation, and US is putting a lot of efforts, both financially and diplomatically, to get other players on board to introduce sanctions. For United Nations, for example, there were only 2 UN-level coordinated sanctions before 1990. That's against South Africa and Rhodesia, and after 1990 we had 24 events of coordinated sanctions, so a 12-fold increase in a comparable period of time. And then this brings us to the puzzle of, if sanctions do not work or rarely work, why do we see more of them, and why do new actors join the crowd introducing sanctions? And then the second puzzle is that if multilateral sanctions seem to be less effective, why do actors put energy into trying to bring more partners on board? And there was a famous paper of Morgan and Schrebach that said that fools suffer gladly, so that actors actually seem to, there's some kind of an anomaly in irrationality in the sanction behavior. But very recent papers indicate that there might have been some flaws in the way the sanctions have been studied and looked at, and that maybe actually actors are rational in their choices. So there was a paper that used network analysis, and that's very much, I think, in favor of this crowd. This was the first attempt to look at sanctions from a network analysis perspective. So sanctions were always thought as a network phenomenon. So Galtung, already a paper from the 60s looking at Rhodesia, a classic on sanctions, already thought of sanctions as a network event. But moving from this abstract level to operationalization, all the models and all the statistics and analysis always looked at things in a dyadic setting. So key sender, target. And this always has been studied this way, both in producing game theory models or utility models that looked at sanctions, and bargaining models. So it was always dyadic, and this network effect or systemic effect has been somehow forgotten. And this brought the interest of Kramer, Heinrich, and Desmarais, and they produced this paper, and very interesting results, very strong systemic effects, very strong interaction. They particularly point at one factor of sanctions is that there's strong reciprocity between the senders. So it's not so much about sender-target, but sender-sender. And there's a degree of transitivity, which means that I might not be directly related to you, but there is an agent in between of us, and I might introduce sanctions on party A only because there is some kind of because my partner is a partner with you, and he wants to help you, therefore I will also help you. So the kind of transitivity, like we have it in economics choices, is A is better than B, then B is better than C.
Is this also like something that you then see really as a directed network pattern that sort of matches up over time, right? So that's so it's really a direct.
Yeah, they also what I could understand from the paper is that you also see it evolving over time. So that was an interesting aspect.
But what I mean is that there are some causal step involved, right? So let's say the US sanctions Russia, and then Russia responses to some middleman of the US or something. Is that something that you see in that order also? Or?
They've seen the reciprocity in sender target, but they didn't necessarily see reciprocity that the target will then also sanction some kind of a third party that's not taking part in sanction but is affiliated to US. That I think wasn't there. So the targets actually seem to be quite lonely, and that was already previously seen in that targets rarely get support, but senders seem to bulk up and support each other, even if they don't have direct interest in introducing those sanctions. They will only do it because a partner of theirs is involved with another partner.
Right.
And there was a new data set called TIES. It's much bigger than the one of Hofbauer and more complete. And there was a study of Morgan and Bapat that looked at the issue of multilateral versus unilateral sanctions, and this one actually turned over completely the literature, showing that they're actually much better and much more effective if introduced in groups. So all the previous studies have actually simply suffered from data bias, and all those theories built around this that simply comes from the lack of sufficient data. So that was a big turning point in the study of sanctions as well. So taking those two things, that the relation is not dyadic, sender-target, but somehow systemic between senders and the target. And it's also not static, it develops over time, so there's a dynamic element, and that actually there's a benefit from doing it together. But I thought of taking those things together and to some kind of a degree of abstraction, and thinking of it as thinking of sanctions as a form of a prisoner's dilemma played between the senders. And maybe first quickly let's go what are the assumptions of this model. Is that there is a foreign policy leader that has the last word, so he decides whether sanctions are introduced or not. So he's a player that can choose A or B, coordinator or defect. He's a rational utility maximizer, so he operates in such a way to maximize utility. He all the actors are of the same size, so there is a symmetry assumption. There is the information is complete but imperfect, so we know what are the payoffs, but we don't know what the other player will do. And the trade operates according to the AJO model, which is that it's a labor capital trade model in which goods and labor flows freely between borders, and the tastes are the same, so some form of uniformity in trade. Now we have two actors, player A and B, that face some kind of a policy crisis with a third party and with a third actor, and they have to decide on a strategy. They can cooperate, which indicates that they will jointly introduce economic sanctions. This is the parity superior outcome with the total welfare of 6, and somehow represents the fact that they still trade with one another. They're not trading with the third party, but there's a form of substitution in their mutual trade, and they benefit from addressing a foreign policy crisis in an effective way, in a joint way. They can also both defect, which means that they still get to trade with this third partner, but they don't address the policy issue, which makes them worse because they value security. And there's the third option, which is that one cooperates and the other one defects. In this setting, the defector benefits from trading with the target. So there's a trade substitution. The trade that normally went from let's say this guy introducing sanctions, this is not. So he gets the surplus trade that normally was associated with the trade between the sender and the target, and he also, to a lower extent of course, than in the cooperate setting, benefits from addressing the foreign policy issue. So someone else did it less effectively, yet it has been somehow signalized. And the sender, so the guy who actually was fooled on the cooperation, so decided to cooperate and was defected upon, well, he gets the short end of the stick because he doesn't get to trade with the target. There is more trade between the defector and the target, and he didn't manage to address the foreign policy issue in the most effective way. So this is why he has a lower payoff. So if we would play this game in a dyadic way, in a static way, of course, the outcome is both defect. That's the Nash equilibrium here. So if two actors meet and will never meet again, the rational strategy is to always defect. But we can always move from static to dynamic, and games can repeat over time. This is a representation of a tit for tat strategy, so that you do to your what has been done to you. The dots or automata represent one actor, and the arrows represent the other actor. So if my default mode is to start cooperating, and I cooperate, which is blue, and then if someone cooperates on me, I also cooperate. If someone cooperates on me, I also cooperate. If someone defects on me, I enter the defection and become a defector. If someone defects on me, I do exactly the same. If someone cooperates with me, I move back to cooperation. So that's a way of representing a tit for tat strategy, and the way the game that we spoke about of coordinating and working on sanctions incident between two actors or more can be played out. And in this setting, the equilibrium, so whether we'll see cooperation or we'll see defection, depends on the discount factor and on how the actors and players value future. And if you have no valuation of the future and you only care about short-term gains, then your strategy is to defect in the first round. And if you have and then you might also decide to defect every other round, given the valuation. If you have a very good valuation, a very strong valuation of the future incomes, if you value future payoffs as much as or comparably to today's money, then you most likely cooperate in the first round and keep on cooperating in the future. We can also move from dyadic to systemic. So we have the same players that we had in the previous slide, but now they meet each other in a larger setting. And there are two ways to study it. One is through the ESS, so through the evolutionary stability. So we have a population of only cooperators or only defectors, and then we sprinkle some cooperators or defector into this mix, and we see whether this will affect the total population, or for what kind of critical value or what kind of discount factor is the population stable, so how many cooperators have to join the whole crowd to make the population change into population of cooperators, or vice versa. If you have a population of defectors, how many cooperators do we need to bring in to turn the whole population, well, blue, talking colors. There's also another way of looking at it, so even one step forward, which is from complex systems, and there you assume that
Nice.
here you go. And there you assume that each of the agents on the plateau gets to cooperate with his or her neighbors. So it's always a group of 9, and you always play against 8 other players. So if everyone cooperates on you, you get a payoff of 8 times 4, that's 32. And if everyone defects on you, then you get a payoff of 8 times 2, that's 16. And this has been studied not in respect to sanctions, and I haven't done complex system myself. I only read about this literature and attended some seminars here at UVA from Dawid Walentek, who's a theoretical evolutionary biologist, also doing economics. And then you can code it that those automata, so those dots or actors who have a memory, so they'll remember what has been done to them before, and they will act strategically and accordingly on their past experience with their direct neighborhood. And what can be tweaked to the system is that you can act more, or there can be local interactions, so that the interactions are slightly more narrowed down, and the reproduction of your behavior, so whether one survives or not, becomes more present on the local level, so that you do some kind of smaller groups within. So there's still cooperation across the board, but the way you reproduce it within your small subset. And this brings quite interesting results, showing that creating this form of local interactions induces cooperation. So the more global is the competition, the more volatile becomes the whole population. So it can either very quickly turn into a population of only cooperators or only defectors. If you have a population of only defectors, but then you increase the level of those local interactions, then you're more likely to induce cooperation. The interesting part of this model is that it somehow represents and overlaps with what we spoke about with networks, that there is a degree of transitivity here. So this one cooperates on this, and the fact that this is a cooperator affects this one, even though they're not direct neighbors. And you also see reciprocity. If many cooperated on me, well, the model predicts 5 at least, I will also more likely be a cooperator as well. So with this in mind, it's an interesting summary that bringing the dynamic effects and bringing the systemic effects, whether it's on the just the evolutionary system or ESS, the evolutionary stability, or in complex system, we can somehow think about how institutions and more frequent interaction, whether it's formal institutions like European Union or informal like free market, can actually bring cooperation. And now, moving from abstract to concrete, European Union is quite an interesting example of how cooperation and sanctions played out. So the orange bar shows, is this the right graph? Yeah, sorry, this is the right graph. So the US sanctions, so we see a smooth path. For EU, it's a bit of a different dynamic. Here we see sanctions of only individual member states, and joint sanctions, and here joint sanctions only. So when all the members took part. What is interesting is that from World War II on to 1965, there was no, all the sanctions introduced by the EU were somehow at the individual member state or jointly 2 or 3 member states, but never the whole of the EU, so never as a whole system. Then from the 60s onward, we see a degree of some first attempts of large-scale cooperation, and only from 1991 it's the case that actually most of the sanctions that have been introduced are sanctions that involve the whole institution, so all 20, at the moment 27 members, but in the past fewer, and we rarely observe sanctions when only one EU member state introduces it without the backing of the whole group. This corresponds to the developments in the institutions of EU. So first there was the Hague Summit of 1969 created an EPC, so European Political Cooperation Platform, and this was a very loose club and without a formal way of meeting, and most of the literature, historical literature, say that it simply completely failed to induce cooperation between members, and actors very frequently couldn't agree or see how they would get a future payback from cooperating today. Then we had the Maastricht Treaty, that already gave some kind of a form and regular platform for meetings and interacting between member states. And finally the Lisbon Treaty, which created a very formal structure of particularly for introducing sanctions. It's now decided on the level of the Council of Ministers, where they all meet and directly interact on this and get a say. So looking at historical sources, the US diplomats constantly complain about the European counterparts, particularly in the 60s. They said that we very often agreed on something and then have deviated upon. So we were supposed to introduce sanctions, we introduced them, and our European counterparts did not fully do it, or went somehow around it, and this was a source of major frustration in the American diplomacy. And the same goes for Europeans discussing this with one another. And what's interesting is the development of Lisbon Treaty. I have spoken about this to the Polish diplomats, and they said that this quite substantially helped and allowed for more interaction when it comes to sanctions, and particularly the recent sanction on Russia. If you look at 2 cases very similar, Russian intervention in Georgia and Russian intervention in Ukraine, in both cases the Central and Eastern European member states have pursued and pushed for sanctions, but the infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure apparently was not sufficient and didn't stimulate enough interaction and also possibility for reciprocity in the previous framework as in the current one. So this is just a kind of a quick plausibility probe, seeing whether there is some form of first-hand evidence for this going together. A few words about what's the next part. I'm going to work more on it and fine-tune the theory and see the ESS, how it plays out, and think about working with the complex systems and adjust it to the payoffs that I have in the matrix that I previously showed, and then a more thorough, systematic empirical test, both on the qualitative and the quantitative side. So that's it for my research. Thank you very much for listening.
Questions?
I have a question. Just to your last point, so you showed that with deeper EU integration, they act more as one player basically in sanctions, but I didn't really get what this means for your approach, because I mean, for me that's like how do you say that? tautology, yeah, they integrate, so they become more one actor, so they act as one actor, so it's not...
Well, that's quite fun because it's not so much that they act as one actor. Sanctions are still introduced very much as on a country level basis. So with sanctions Russia and sanctions on Russia, for example, countries like Spain and Italy were very much not in favor of sanctions because it was not in any way their Ukraine or Georgia, for example, were not in any way an interest for them. But because of this, let's say, transitivity or reciprocity, so transitivity element here meant that, and that's what I got from my interviews, is that Poland wanted sanctions very much, and Germany was also quite keen on them. And the relation, so Poland used this as a bargaining chip through Germany with Spain. So we have this. So Spain itself was not keen to help Poland, but because there was the Germany in between, it allows for some kind of mediating process, and the transitivity of preferences moved on back and forth. And this is something that we didn't see in the EU structures before, under the previous settings. So there is there's no EU level decision making, only the implementation is EU level. But the decisions are still very much at the government level and very strongly there.
Okay, and what's the role then of EU integration?
That it allows for more frequent interactions. So if you have a stable institution in which you know that in some period of time you might yourself face a policy problem yourself, you know that you can count on reciprocity from your partners there.
Did Jouke have a...
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, what I not entirely understand, I'm afraid, is the thing with the neighbors. So a neighbor in this case means a geographic neighbor in your model?
Well, I have, as I said, I'm not so great in complex systems, and this is a big issue, that there's either a way of phrasing it as geographic neighbors, or you look at it as policy problems, and then you will have the same countries appearing on the matrix many times, which is also okay. But it may be the case that you have France's interest in in Africa and in other regions, and also in Europe. So it's not only so clear. It's probably
you just need a distance metric, right? So some metric that says you are this much intertwined, or you are so much invested in the other. So actually the matrix is a nice representation. But perhaps it assumes that it's like a regular network, right? So everybody has the same number of neighbors, but that may not be the case. And you could also take like a distance metric, like for example, whether you're a neighbor. So that's a very simple one. But also whether you're economically invested into a certain country to a certain extent, right? I don't know. Number of foreign direct investments from one to the other.
Initially think, when I think of economic sanctions, like of a fully connected graph, a wholly integrated network of all kinds of countries. And if you impose sanctions, then it's not necessarily that Germany only imposes sanctions on its neighbor countries or so, or the US or whatever, because then it would only have Mexico and Canada. So yeah, I think that's important to think of what is the distance between countries and what is their connection. And so
yeah, that's definitely more resilient also to simply put in the empirical part of the analysis.
But I think the point is not about distance at all. The point is, if you restrict the interactions to be local, and local doesn't mean neighbor countries, then you get that the optimal strategy is a different one. So, like it's more like a theoretical argument.
Yeah, but what is local needs to have some. If you want to test it empirically, then you need to know what local is. Local.
I have another question concerning this dynamic approach. So there, the idea is that the situation that happened before is taken into account for the new decision making.
Yeah.
And there, I'm wondering, does, for example, a regime change not have an impact on how, for example, this memory works? That if another government or another political-oriented government is in place, also this memory transition doesn't really work?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And then the question that whether this would, yeah, I don't have a straightforward answer. Just more some anecdotal evidence. I mean, for countries like US or EU, we do have a pretty long institutional memory because of the way civil service operates and this long-term foreign policy strategy is devised. And most of the sanction-sending countries are well-developed democracies. So there's one way to simply say, well, on average, most of the senders have a long-term foreign policy, and the variations are not so large. But that's definitely a plausible claim. On the other hand, when you look at countries like Russia, where you had major changes from moving from aristocratic rule to communism to modern current situation, you still see very similar trends in expansion and foreign policy interest has not changed very much from the Tsars to Stalin. I mean, Bolshevik invasion of Poland in 1920 was very much in line with what would have been done previously by the Tsar administration and their priorities in the West, or in other way of looking at Europe at least.
Okay.
All right.
How are you thinking of measuring this memory? Because I mean, when you do this kind of analysis, then it's a simple game and the game doesn't change. But in this case, I mean, you don't only have memory about cooperation in previous sanctions, but you also have like the previous other kind of interaction. Like if somebody defeated in the like imposing a sanction against a third country, but for the last 10 years you've been a great market partner with him, trade partner with him, then you probably are going to cooperate instead of defeat in the next sanction. So like
two players and one.
So you have three players, and then one decided to have a sanction on, or impose a sanction on the third one, and hopes that the second one also does it, but they don't. But that was 10 years ago, and since then the two first partners have been trading a lot and have like great relationships. And then like it's 10 years after now, and then the first partner wants to have or the second partner wants to impose a sanction on the third partner, and hopes that the first one will also cooperate. And if you use a tit for tat strategy, then that partner will defeat because the other one defeated. But you've been trading for 10 years, so it's probably not gonna defeat.
Yeah.
Like how do you, this is not an isolated game, you have many things around it. How are you gonna, operationalize it?
I would have to draw it and think about it. I don't think I can give an answer at all.
How do you measure the dependence between all those actors in that system? It's very difficult.
Yeah. That's for this. There is a slightly simple answer, is that luckily from the data that I have, most of the sender target trade relations are rather weak. So there are not many cases in which the sanctions actually had a major impact on the senders. That's very few instances of it in the data set.
Well, it depends also on the size of the receiver, right? So if you put sanctions on North Korea, who has only 5 billion of export, and they lose 4 billion of it, it may be very severe, but we think over 4 billion is not so much between the US and Russia, right? So
but well, again, with Russia, they actually also did not have the economy. This is like the extreme case. I mean, Russia and Iran, for example, where the Iranian section had non-visible impact on the senders, and the Russian sanctions negligible. I mean, this is being spoken of 0.1% of experts because of substitution, and this is what I've seen in my own ministry, that we have found alternative markets for nearly all products that we wanted. All the apples went to Vietnam, and all the other things ended up in somewhere in Latin America. So this somehow allows to control for it, and then give some confidence.
So when are they useful?
Pardon?
When are they useful? Economic sanctions.
Yeah, they seem to be never useful.
Yeah.
They seem to be, they might also work as a stronger signaling mechanism. So this is sending signal with a signal squared, or in such a way. Because even if they're very strong, so Iraq is an example that there was a loss of GDP of 45%, they still didn't force Saddam Hussein to give in. There's also that's the biggest problem with quantifying the success rate, and looking at sanctions that are they introduced in order to succeed, or are they introduced in order to signal something, and if we work together on sending the signal, it's more likely to work. So slightly moving away from this effectiveness to cooperation and signaling.
Maybe to the signaling thing, I was thinking about the Balkan Wars in the 90s. Every time you want to signal that you are choosing one side, you punish the other one, right? So that's what the US did with Serbia, and the Greeks did it the other way around with all other countries. So the Greeks said, okay, we're with them, and the other one said, they didn't say it like publicly, but that was basically the, like you choose sides by just saying, okay, we have an embargo on this country A or B, and not on C, something like that. But I don't think that it, like, what kind of effect should it have? It was like, I don't know. I can't think of any, so, yeah.
Yeah, I think Yugoslavia is an interesting example of also the moment when the institutional changes came in, because the European Union ended up going in all directions and could completely fail to coordinate its action.
How is it measured, the success of sanctions? You're looking at GDP or what?
Yeah, that varies between researchers. So, Hofbauer simply does it qualitatively and simply looks at whether if the objective was a regime change, whether it happened or to what extent, whether if the objective was to improve human rights, there's a human rights index, whether it really went up. So it's more of a case-by-case approach, and this is where there's scope for mistake, and where this other guy Pape came in and revised this whole data set and said in most of those cases sanctions were at best only a minor contributor to the overall change, because there was at some point, a military intervention or some domestic uprising that changed the outcome, and then this is why his number is different and it's much lower, it's 5%.
Just one other thought is also that, do you know if there is some, how to say that, letter of escalation or something, so that you say, okay, if you want to punish someone, or you want to show that you're not in accordance with something that happens in another country, then the first thing you do is introduce economic sanctions, right? But there's always space to say, okay, the next step is that we make a total embargo, or that we try to seek alliances around the world to exert pressure on a country, and the last step would be military power or something like that.
Yeah. So the data set distinguishes between the type of sanctions that you introduce, whether they're import, export, financial, or suspension of aid. But then again, it varies per country what matters for. So Suriname, for example, has been only Netherlands introduced sanctions on Suriname together with US, but did not manage to get European support on this. But because of the nature of single market, of course, there was a problem with import and export sanctions, but they did introduce financial sanctions, and they did work They were very painful because of the interference of the financial sector of both countries. So then again, this will have to be checked on per country basis, and if you have more senders, then it becomes a very complex system of because some countries will only cut aid, and others will go for a completely full-fledged embargo.
Given that it is in 12 seconds, exactly 12 o'clock, perhaps we should take the further discussion offline, at least give those who want to continue working a chance to do. So thanks again, Dawid.
Thank you.
So how long have you been